When he died in 323 BC at the age of 33 years old, Alexander the Great could have left a huge legacy. Could have left one. I mean, he was undefeated in battle. At the time of his death, get this, he held the following titles: King of Macedonia, Pharaoh of Egypt, King of Persia, and King of Asia. Quite an accomplishment. And yet his empire quickly fell to pieces. When he was on his deathbed in Babylon, where he had hoped to build a new capital, he was asked who would run the empire after him. And he replied, it should go to the strongest. And I mean, that was virtually an invitation for insurrection and chaos. And that's exactly what happened. His empire was quickly destroyed from within and without, and it left only a stub in Greece. And we remember Alexander today as a great military leader whose hard-won victories were undone by a failure to pass his leadership on to the next generation. And sadly, that situation is not too unusual, even in our current environment of businesses and nonprofit organizations. Economist Saskia Becker and Hans Havide studied entrepreneurs and succession by looking at what happened to 500 companies after their founders died. It's amazing. They discovered a sharp drop-off in business. In fact, on average, sales fell off by 60%. And 20% of those same companies were dead in 2 years. So apparently, when the founder's vision and drive disappears, their organizations suffer serious decline or death. This morning, I'd like to suggest that succession is the measure of effective leadership. Your ability to take what you've created, to take the mission, the culture, the values, the vision for your organization and pass it on to the next generation is the measure of your leadership. If we're good leaders, the mission will live on. If we're bad leaders, it'll die with us. This is why, by the way, the concept of paradosis is so important to the process. This Greek word, as most of you know, literally means a handing down or a transmission from one person to another or to a group. It's often translated into the English as tradition. For example, St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:2, and by the way, as a convert and as a former evangelical, I didn't know these verses existed in the Bible. You know, I thought maybe they were invisible ink, and suddenly after I became Orthodox, they reappeared. But 1 Corinthians 11:2 says, now I praise you, brethren, that you remember in all things and keep the traditions that I delivered to you. And then again he says in 2 Thessalonians 2:15, therefore, brethren, stand fast and hold the traditions which you were taught, whether by word or by example. So obviously, as Orthodox Christians, we understand the importance of this in the church, right? But I would suggest that it's broader than that in its application, particularly for those of us that are in business or working in nonprofit organizations outside of the church. Think of it as a relay race. You know, if you're going to successfully complete the race, you have to run your leg fast and very efficiently. But it's not enough, because if you don't hand the baton on to the next runner in the queue, you lose. And that, I think, is the challenge of leadership. And based on this premise that succession is the measure of effective leadership, Jesus was arguably the greatest leader of all time. Just as he promised, his followers went on to do even greater things than he had done. I mean, consider this. According to Acts 17:6, within a generation, the disciples, and this is a direct quote from that passage, turned the world upside down. Within 7 generations, by 318, Constantine had embraced the gospel and made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. And here, 2 millennia later, you and I are at a conference talking about it. Incredible succession story. So I would suggest that if we're serious about our desire to pass on the vision of our organizations, the mission, the core values, the culture, because it's not just about us, it's about the work that we've been called to do, then we could do no better than to consider the leadership strategy of Jesus, which, as Charles mentioned, is the title of my talk this morning. This strategy, the one that Jesus himself employed, can be expressed in 3 principles. Principle number 1, focus on the few rather than the many. Focus on the few rather than the many. You know, so much discussion about leadership today is focused on reaching the masses. You know, we're concerned when we turn over the back of a book and we look at the bio of the author, or we read their biography online. We want to know what their social media following is, or do they speak at large conferences, or have they written any best-selling books? All these things seem to be so important. And in fact, my recollection of the story, Charles, was that you wanted me to speak on the topic of social media and marketing and how do we get the word out, right? Which is a worthy topic, and I speak on that, all the time. But the truth is, I got involved in social media because I saw it as an unprecedented opportunity to extend our influence and really to expand the message. And I still believe that is today. But I want you to consider something this morning. It's not just about reach. It's not just about breadth, trying to get to as many people as we possibly can. I mean, if that were the goal, and stay with me here for a minute, Jesus came at the wrong time. I mean, wouldn't it have made more sense that God would send his son into our time rather than the first century, before we had developed the internet and modern communication? How much more valuable, if reach were the objective, if he had come now? I mean, think what could have happened. I mean, Donald Trump has 38 million Twitter followers. I checked it yesterday. Just think what Jesus could have had. Facebook has 2 billion active users a month. With that one social media network, Jesus could have reached over 25% of the world's population. 51% of the world's population has access to the internet. Jesus could have tapped into that with a blog, with a podcast, maybe with even his own YouTube channel. It would have been awesome. But what if it wasn't about the numbers? What if it was about something else instead? Because Galatians 4:4 says this, when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son. He wasn't early, he wasn't late, he came in the fullness of time. Certainly, God wants all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth, as St. Paul reminds us in 1 Timothy 2:4. But paradoxically, perhaps, a strategy focused on the many is not the way to reach the many. It's deceptive, because everything in our culture would say exactly the opposite. And I think we have to be careful, both in the church and outside the church, as Orthodox Christians, to not be deceived by this. Instead, God's strategy was to focus on the few, to not go broad, but to go deep. Only this would create the depth and impact necessary to sustain the mission over time. So I want to examine this strategy in a little bit more detail. Jesus' strategy included what I call the 5 circles of influence. The 5 circles of influence. Circle number 1, he led himself. This is where all leadership starts. Self-leadership precedes team leadership and public influence. This may sound a little harsh, but I want to say it, and I'm going to unpack it a little bit later in my talk. But if you can't lead yourself, you can't and shouldn't lead others. Circle number 1, he led himself. Circle number 2, he confided in the 3. Jesus had an inner circle comprised of Saints Peter, James, and John. He took them on special outings like the Transfiguration. There he allowed them to witness his glory. But he also shared his humanity, including his agonies and his temptations in the Garden of Gethsemane. He prayed with these 3. He taught them things he didn't teach the others. He even introduced them to his heavenly family. They were his closest friends and confidants. And after the resurrection, we hear more about them than the others. Circle 3, he trained the 12. He chose the 12 disciples to be with him, Mark 3:14 says. He taught them and also gave them assignments. However, and this is critical, and we'll come back to this in a moment, he shared with them his daily life. Like the Apostle Paul would do years later, he poured into them his very life, 1 Thessalonians 2:8. And because of this, he entrusted them with power to do the work he himself had done. In fact, he promised that they would actually do works that were greater than his. See John 14, verses 12 through 14. So that's circle number 3. Circle number 4, which I could spend an entire session on, he mobilized the 70. So Jesus also had a larger group to whom he gave specific assignments. And I want you to listen to this because it's so amazing today in the whole leadership discussion. What he said to them in Luke chapter 10 and verse 1, he said, "After these things the Lord appointed 70 others also, and sent them 2 by 2 before his face into every city and place where he himself was about to go," kind of the advance guard. "Then he said to them, 'The harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go your way. Behold, I send you out as lambs among wolves.'" So he's not pulling any punches. He's telling them it's going to be tough. It's a tough assignment. And get this, carry neither money bag, knapsack, nor sandals, and greet no one along the road. So he doesn't give them a lot of resources. And I think sometimes today we think that we can't do the work of leadership or can't fulfill the calling because we don't have the resources. But I'm here to tell you that the calling and the vision precede the resources showing up. We get this so often backwards as leaders. We say, well, we'll have the vision when the money shows up. My banker has never once come to my doorstep and left a pile of money and said, "Just tell me later what you're going to do with it." That's not the way it works. The vision starts the conversation. The vision attracts the resources. And Jesus gave them one amazing mission, but very little resources. And he says, "But whatever house you enter, first say peace to this house. And if a son of peace is there, your peace will rest on us. If not, it will return to you. And remain in the same house, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the laborer is worthy of his wages. Do not go forth from house to house. Whatever city you enter, and they receive you, eat such things as are set before you." And he goes on, and he tells them, heal the sick and cast out demons. No big deal. While you're at it, do these things. Enormous calling upon their lives. But he was able to mobilize the 70. Circle 5, he taught and fed the multitudes. Yes, Jesus did have a public ministry. He occasionally spoke to thousands. But it's interesting to me that he didn't pander to these groups or tickle their ears. He confronted the status quo. He jarred his listeners' sensibilities. He often taught them in parables. And interestingly, this is counterintuitive to me, he didn't feel the need to clarify everything. In fact, he often left his audience confused, wondering what he meant. His goal was apparently to shift their paradigm and get them to think. But what I would suggest to you this morning is that we often get this backwards. We work from the outside in rather than the inside out. And if we're going to follow the leadership strategy of Jesus, we need to focus more on those innermost concentric circles. Notice the priority of the few. Where did Jesus spend most of his time? It was with the 3 and the 12, and with his Father. Other biblical characters have employed a similar strategy. Think of Moses in the Old Testament in Exodus chapter 18. There he is with all the children of Israel, fresh into the desert. And naturally, you get that many people together, you're going to have disputes. And so they all brought them to Moses. And Moses is sitting there listening to these complaints all day long. His father-in-law, Jethro, shows up. Again, this is all in Exodus chapter 18. And he watches him for a couple of days. And he says, Moses, dude, you're going to wear yourself out if you keep doing this. It's not good for you. It's not good for the people. And what is he exhorting to do? He says, appoint captains of thousands and captains of hundreds and captains of tens. And you hear every difficult dispute that they can't solve, but give them the power, the authority to solve the issues you can't resolve. This left Moses free to focus on the few. St. Paul articulated a similar strategy in 2 Timothy 2:22. And here's what he says to St. Timothy. He says, and the things you've heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. There you have it in one sentence. It was the leadership strategy of Jesus, now re-expressed and re-articulated by St. Paul. We have 4 generations. We have St. Paul, St. Timothy, faithful men, and others also, the relay race. The entire thing breaks down if St. Paul fumbles the handoff to St. Timothy, or if St. Timothy doesn't find faithful men, or the faithful men don't pass the baton on to others also. I'm 62 years old, and I think by God's grace, I hope that I still have a lot of years left to contribute, but I'm thinking about different things at 62 than I was thinking about at 30. Like I never contemplated my mortality when I was in my 30s, but now I realize that it's not going to last forever. I have now a small company, 28 full-time employees, but I'm doing my best to implement this strategy in my own company so that I'm spending more and more time building relationships with the people I expect to succeed me. In fact, and sometimes you have to do this, we've cut several profitable programs from our company in the last couple of years just to enable me to have more time to spend with my team. That's the most important work that I do as a leader. It's more important than speaking at large conferences. I've whittled my speaking schedule down from about 80 events a year to about 5. We do a lot of staff training and a lot of informal time, and I'll get into that more also. But here's some of the tough questions that I'm asking myself, and I would encourage you, if you lead an organization, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, in the church or outside of the church, you might want to ask yourself these questions. I'm asking myself this question: where am I now investing my best thinking and my greatest energy? Where am I now investing my best thinking and my greatest energy? The few or the many? The inner circle or the masses? And then this question: what needs to get put on my calendar so I'm spending consistent, regular time with my inner circle? What gets scheduled gets done. And my intentions usually just kind of drift away unless they make it onto my calendar. I want to give you kind of a practical action step on this first point. And it's this: can you identify, can you write down who your inner circle is? Who are the people that God has put on your heart, has put in your organization, that you think might be the ones to take the mission when you pass on? And it might not even be passing on. It may be going to another assignment. Because again, the measure of your leadership is not what's done while you're there, but what happens afterwards. That's principle number 1, focus on the few rather than the many. Sorry this keeps popping, but I tend to do that. Okay, that leads us to principle number 2. This one is so important. And you see it in Jesus' life, And you don't see it a lot elsewhere in our busy, frantic pace. Principle number 2, focus on relationships rather than transactions. Focus on relationships rather than transactions. So much of organizational life is focused on transactions, whether we're developing products or marketing those products, calling meetings, troubleshooting problems, negotiating supplier contracts, managing the supply chain, managing through HR issues, etc. And obviously, these are important. Nothing wrong with them. But Jesus was all about building relationships. In fact, it was out of his relationship with the disciples that everything else flowed. I think too many leaders are looking for the magic strategy, the tips and the techniques that'll somehow make them better leaders. And all those things are fine in its proper place, but if you have those as a scaffolding without the foundation of deep personal relationships, they will not work, and people will feel manipulated. In Mark 3:14, I mentioned this verse earlier, Mark 3:14 and 15, I want to just read it to you. Then he appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have power to heal sicknesses and to cast out demons. Now, I want you to notice 2 things about this short passage. First, Jesus chose his successors. He wasn't passive, just hoping, waiting for the right people to show up. He didn't put out a call for volunteers. Instead, he went out looking for the right people. And when he found them, he asked them to follow him. And I think in similar fashion, even if you're in a nonprofit, we need to choose who our inner circle is going to be. Sometimes the worst answer is to wait for the volunteers. But this needs to be a deliberate, conscious choice, even if you've inherited your team. And I've watched this even in my own parish as we've got a new pastor now, and he's sort of inherited a new team. Thankfully, some of us made the cut. But I wouldn't have objected if he decided to have some other people involved in the leadership. But we need to be clear about identifying them, be clear about the commitment, and then ask them to join us in our mission. But get this, not only did he choose his successors, he chose his disciples to be with him. Relationship was at the core. All this other stuff that he says, sending them out to preach, having power to heal sicknesses, casting out demons, flowed out of this relationship that the disciples had with their Savior. Now, notice what he didn't do. He didn't enroll them in a school or a formal program. Nothing wrong with that. I'm on the board of trustees of St. Vlad's. I believe in Christian education and seminary training. But that's not what Jesus enrolled them to do. He didn't meet with them occasionally or infrequently, give them assignments, go out and do them, send a report back to corporate periodically. Instead, he was with them. He lived with them day in, day out for 3 years. Listen to me, this is critically important. Discipleship is more than a cognitive transaction. It's not simply intellectual transfer. Truth, values, culture are more often caught than taught. If we're going to be successful in passing on our mission to subsequent generations, we must spend time with those that we expect to succeed us. Time. Formal time, informal time. And yes, there will be formal meetings, times when we, meet to impart the vision, articulate the mission, develop plans, teach and troubleshoot, coordinate the work. All that's important. But there also needs to be informal time of just sharing life. That's from which our leadership springs. Jesus built the relationships with his disciples in at least 6 ways, and there's probably more than this, but I've cataloged these through the years, and there's at least 6 different ways. First of all, he shared his true, authentic self. Now think about this. He invited the disciples to witness the transfiguration, so they got to the essence, or a little glimpse, of who he was in his divinity. But he also invited them to witness the agony and the humiliation, all that was wrapped up in his humanity. I used to think, as a parent, I have 5 daughters, as Charles mentioned, that I could never let them see me weak, that I had to be strong, that I had to look like I was all put together. And what I found is that didn't work too well as a parent. When I started to be honest and transparent with what I was struggling with, and invited them into that, even asking my daughters to pray for me on many occasions, suddenly we were connected with a deep bond. It made all the difference. And I have done the opposite too. I've taken them to things where I've won awards and let them share in that because it's a group effort. But I think it's really important that we share our true, authentic selves. And that feels risky, doesn't it? To be honest about who we really are. Because there's sort of the public persona, and then there's who we are. And sometimes those things aren't in alignment. And we can pretend like they are, but the only people we'll fool are ourselves. And one of the greatest things we have to guard against as leaders is self-deception. And being authentic, being true with those that are in our inner circle is a way to guard against that. The second way that Jesus built these relationships was he allowed them to watch him work. It was kind of like an apprentice program. He took them with him. He took time to explain the why behind the what. But he didn't feel the need to close every loop. He sometimes left them bewildered, confused, knowing that eventually they would understand. Third way, he gave them assignments designed to stretch them. Are you giving to your people assignments designed to stretch them, or are you simply giving them assignments in their comfort zone? Have you ever thought about this? Nothing really great happens inside your comfort zone. All the really important stuff, the answers to your prayers, the places where the mission or the cause is really advanced, the place where you experience breakthroughs, is that in the comfort zone or the discomfort zone? The discomfort zone. And as leaders, we need to embrace that. We have to go first into that area. But Jesus gave them assignments designed to stretch them. He sent them out to preach, which, for those of you that preach on a regular basis, may not sound that scary. But I remember the first time I ever stood up to give a public presentation. I was 18 years old. I was in a Protestant church. In fact, I was a missionary for a summer. And on a Thursday, the pastor said to me, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to be out of town this weekend, and I want you to preach." I kind of threw up a little bit. It scared me to death. And I survived it, barely. By the way, I was listening to a Jerry Seinfeld CD the other day. And he said that speaking in front of a crowd is the number one fear of the average American. We probably know that, right? I mean, can you relate to that? I certainly can. Number 2 is death. And so then he goes on to say, in other words, if you have to be at a funeral, you'd rather be in the casket than doing the eulogy. So he gave them big assignments. He told them to heal diseases, cast out demons. But can you imagine? You're given that assignment? Yeah, right. He gave them authority in addition to responsibility. This is important, obviously, as leaders to do. And he didn't give them any resources. It was basically like, figure it out. Here's why, by the way, why I believe he didn't give them any resources. The most important resource that someone can have, the most important resource, it's more important than money, It's more important than time. It's more important than talent. You know what it is? Resourcefulness. And the only way you get resourceful is when you experience boundaries. This is why it's not a bad thing to have limitations, to have boundaries, to not have all the money that you wished you could have to do what you want to do. Because most of us, by the way, the only organization on the planet that has that kind of system is the federal government. And look what happens. So much waste, so much fraud, so much, yes, they do some good. But resourcefulness is a very important and good thing to develop on the part of our people. Here's the fourth way that he built these relationships. And as leaders, we need to get really particularly good at this. He asked them deep, penetrating questions. Now, as a young leader, I thought it was all about having the answers, didn't you? If I was in a meeting with my boss, I had to have all the answers. Or if I was leading my team, I had to be the answer man. I had to answer all their questions. But get this. In the Gospels, Jesus asks many more questions than he answers. To be precise, he asked 307 questions. True confession, I didn't count them. I Googled it. He's asked 183 questions, of which he only answers 3. Here are just a few examples. I'm not going to give you all 307, so relax. He said, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And even more penetratingly, "Who do you say I am?" Or, "Why did you doubt?" It's a good question. Why did I doubt? I've had that happen to me over and over again. I've been reading back through some old journals where I was going through some very difficult times, and God came through. It all worked out. A couple years later, find myself in a similar situation, go through doubts, loss of perspective, discouragement, all works out. Why did you doubt? It's a good question to ask. It's given me some moments of self-reflection. Simon said of John, "Do you love me?" Very personal, very direct. And then one of my favorite questions that Jesus asked 3 times in the Gospels, "What do you want me to do for you?" What's really amazing about that question, he's standing in front of people who have obvious physical problems. It's clear. Bartimaeus, he's blind. It's clear what he wants, right? But Jesus forces him to clarify it in his own thinking. What do you want me to do? So clearly asking questions was central to Jesus' leadership methodology. And let me just commend to you one book that's excellent for leaders on how to ask great questions. It's called The Coaching Habit by Michael Bungay Stanier, Stanier, The Coaching Habit. The fifth way that he built these relationships was that he corrected them and even rebuked them when necessary. This one's tough for me because the truth is I'm a recovering people pleaser. I want people to like me. And so it's easy for me, if I'm not careful, to dance around issues rather than to just hit them head on. And usually the shortest distance between where your people are and where they need to be is the truth. And to be honest, but kind, speaking the truth in love is an important quality of a leader. And then finally, the sixth way he built these relationships is that he expressed his belief in them. He promised that even if they believe in him, they will do greater works than even he did. He was absolutely confident of that. And I think too often we don't express that. We're afraid that maybe if we affirm people, if we express our belief, that they'll get puffed up with pride. Not the truth. People are so thirsty for that affirmation. Every leader I've ever met, even leaders of Fortune 500 companies, have a secret fear that they're inadequate, that they're not enough. When I was made the CEO of Thomas Nelson, I literally had this thought inside my head rattling around. It's only a matter of time before they figure out I don't know what I'm doing. And I kind of had that thought almost every day. And as I've spoken to other leaders in large corporations, they're like, yeah, especially in the middle of the night. Do I have what it takes? And for us as leaders to say to the people that we're leading frequently and regularly, you have what it takes. I believe in you. You can do this. You've got this. Sometimes, you just think back on your own experience. That's been the very thing that's enabled you to accomplish what you've accomplished. If it hadn't been for that professor, if it hadn't been for that mentor, that boss, that friend who said to you at that moment of crisis, you've got this, I believe in you, you can do it. That's how significant our words are. And you and I as leaders have the power to persuade people, to encourage people to go beyond what they would naturally do. So he expressed his belief in them. St. Paul also modeled this whole thing in 1 Thessalonians 2, 7 and 8. He wrote, but we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. So affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God. Let me get that. Yes, that. But not only that, not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. We need to build these deep relationships with our inner circle. Just an example. One of the most powerful moments that I've ever had with my team was unplanned. We had gone to a house that we had rented in the country, which we do every year for strategic planning. But I was very intentional that in the evenings we wouldn't talk business. And one evening in particular, because these are all young people with families, and I just wanted to talk about the rest of life. And by the way, this hopefully is not a newsflash for anyone in business, but there is life outside of business. I know it's hard to imagine sometimes. People don't know what to do with themselves on the weekends, so they fall back into working, don't know what to do in the evening, so they check email. But there is a life outside of that, and I try to model that in my company by not talking business all the time when I'm with the people in my company. And by the way, you could argue that's for a selfish reason. And here's why. I know that if they're not taking care of their families, and if they're not taking care of their health, and if they're not attending to these other areas of their life, it's going to back up into the business. If you've ever worked in a business where somebody's gone through a divorce, it has a catastrophic impact on the business. If somebody loses their health, catastrophic impact on the business. And I realize that we can't control all that, but I do want to give attention to it. So anyway, we're sitting there that night, not talking about business, and as the candles burned low, and as the conversation wore on, some of these young couples began to open up to us. And by the way, I had all the spouses there too, and my wife Gail was with me. And they began to ask us some really, really tough questions about marriage. Like, what do we do when? And what do you do if? And just really honest, thought-provoking questions. And we just talked into the wee hours of the night. And several of them told me later that that was one of the most consequential conversations they'd ever had. But you and I had the privilege of leading those. And it's important that we lead those. If all we're focused on is business or organizational results and don't take care for the life of the people at organizations, then we risk the entire mission. So the tough questions I'm asking myself, and by the way, I intentionally try to make lots of time for those informal times. Last week we had a staff training time, which was a formal time, and then we went bowling. We had a bowling contest. And it was about 2 hours of just fun. I'm taking them all on a retreat in January. No business, no discussion of business, just being together and enjoying one another. So here's a question. Am I inviting my inner circle into my life on a regular basis so they can learn not just from what I say, but who I am and what I do? And here's an action step for you on this second principle. Schedule a time on your calendar to get with your team in an informal way. Schedule a time to be with them that has nothing to do with the organization or the business. You'll be amazed at how much trust flows out of that, how much your leadership increases how much more open they are to your ideas. So that's principle number 2, focus on relationships rather than transactions. Principle number 3, this is the final one, focus on yourself rather than others. Now, I want to go back to those 5 circles of influence that I shared with you before, and principle number 1 was leadership begins with you. And I said, and I'll say again, if you can't lead yourself, you can't lead others. Self-leadership precedes team leadership. Self-leadership precedes public influence. Self-leadership precedes long-term impact. Moreover, if you can't lead yourself, you shouldn't lead others. Why? Because of the law of replication. My dad was injured in the Korean War, almost mortally so. He was in a coma for 6 months after taking some shrapnel to the head. And as a result of that, he's always walked with a severe limp. A lot of neurological damage, but the physical expression of that was he walked with a severe limp. Well, I can remember distinctly at the age of about 5 when my mom said to me, "Michael, you don't need to walk with a limp." And she explained to me, she said, "Your dad walks with a limp because he was hurt in the war." Well, as a young boy, wanting to be big, looking up to my dad, I just thought that's what you do if you're big. You know, you walk with a limp. And this is the law of replication in action. This law says that like begets like. Dogs beget dogs. Trees beget trees. People beget people. But the law also applies to leadership. Like it or not, you'll replicate yourself. Your followers will adopt your behaviors, your habits, and if you have a strong personality, even your mannerisms. Years ago, I remember visiting one of our clients at their corporate headquarters, and I was amused to see his staff unconsciously imitating him, down to the cadence of their speech and the inflection of his voice. It was like they were paid impersonators. Well, this has powerful implications for us in leadership. Unconsciously, your people are going to mimic you. Here's what that means. If you're late to meetings, your people will be late to meetings. If you don't take responsibility when things go wrong and instead blame others or circumstances, when things go wrong for your people, they won't take responsibility. They'll blame others or they'll blame circumstances. If you're angry and defensive when you get negative feedback, your people will be negative and defensive when they get negative feedback. Conversely, if you're humble and grateful, your people will be humble and grateful. If you're warm and engaging, your people will be warm and engaging. If you're even-tempered and unflinching under fire, your people will be even-tempered and unflinching under fire. So at this stage of my business, I see it as my greatest responsibility to embody the vision that I have for my team, to be the leader I want them to become. And trust me, I don't always get this right. Occasionally I do, but I'm trying, and I think it's worth trying. So how can we grow in this aspect of self-leadership? And I want to just give you 3 ways as I conclude here. First of all, through self-awareness. Self-awareness is the ability to know ourselves and see ourselves as others see us. There's nothing more dangerous than a self-unaware leader. Jesus was self-aware. He knew who he was. He knew why he was here. He knew the impact he was having on others. Thomas Nelson was acquired by private equity right before the recession. And I remember the managing partner would come into our corporate boardroom to review our quarterly results with the team. Literally, the entire meeting, he was on his smartphone, not paying attention to what was going on. He would often ask us questions that we had just answered moments before. And I remember one specific meeting where we had had an amazing quarter. Even in the midst of a recession, we had done really well. We had exceeded our budget. And so we were kind of touting the numbers and feeling a little bit proud of ourselves and sharing this, thinking, this is our best thing. And he looked at us and he said, yeah, I get all that, but let's talk about the problems. You could hear almost the air go out of the room. My inner circle, who was with me in the board meeting that day because they were all making presentations, left utterly deflated. It took me a week's worth of remedial repair just to keep them on board because they had options. But this was a leader who was not self-aware, had no idea that there was a wake trailing his actions just like one trails a boat. And the same is true for you, and the same is true for me. How can we be more self-aware? By the way, this is one of the values of therapy. You know, frankly, to sometimes just take the time to get at the triggers and the things that really impact us, these unconscious forces that swirl around in our subconscious. It's also the value of self-assessments. I love self-assessments. I think it can give you language and nuances about why you are the way you are that not only will explain your sins and your temptations, but oftentimes explain for you your strengths, the good things that you do, and how you can employ those to the glory of God and to the furtherance of His kingdom. It's the value of journaling, taking time to intentionally push the pause button and reflect. Or the value of honest feedback. I had an executive coach when I was at Thomas Nelson. I paid a lot of money to her. And I told her, look, if I'm going to get my money's worth, I want you to be absolutely honest with me. She said, okay. You sure? I said, yeah. So one day we're in a financial review meeting. All the executives were there to present what had happened the last month. I was that guy I mentioned before, but now I'm on the leading side of this. And at the break, after we'd had a couple hours of presentations, Eileen was her name. She came up to me and she said, are you angry? And I said, no, I'm good. She said, really? You're not upset with something? I said, no, I'm fine. She said, well, you might want to tell your face. Because she said, you've had nothing but a scowl on your face for the last 2 hours. And she said, I'm just going to tell you something. It's intimidating. She said, you couple that scowl with your authority, people are intimidated, they're nervous, they're not their best selves when they're in your presence. That slayed me. And I have had, this sounds stupid, but as a leader I'm committed to this, I have had to intentionally work on smiling. And it's taken a lot of work. You know, I've had to do it when I'm speaking, I've had to do it when I'm having difficult conversations, and you don't want to be happy all the time, but to smile at people. Because the slightest flick of the wrist, for many of your followers, they create an entire narrative around it, right? People have to have stories to survive, and they will create ones unless you're intentional. Okay, through self-awareness. Here's another way, through self-development. Self-development means taking the initiative to grow and become more mature. Even Jesus, Luke 2:40 says he grew in wisdom, stature, and favor with God and with men. And we need to practice self-development. The organization is never going to grow higher in their leadership than we are in our leadership. And so many leaders get to a certain point and just stagnate. Theosis doesn't just happen. It requires our active participation. What are you doing? What am I doing to grow spiritually, intellectually, emotionally, physically? And then through self-control. This is the third way. And I don't mean this in the normal sense, but here's how I mean it. Self-control is the ability to say no for the sake of a greater yes. Many leaders are notoriously bad at this, myself included. But to say no to the lesser things, to say yes to the greater things. Jesus practiced self-control. Even when Mary and Martha reminded them that Lazarus was sick unto death, he didn't just drop what he was doing. He said no to the world, the flesh, and the devil in order to say yes to his Father and the mission that the Father had given him. We need to practice self-control. I don't have time this morning to unpack this, but in our attention, can we say no to distractions so we can be focused on the deep, meaningful work that moves our organizations forward? If you've not read Cal Newport's book, Deep Work, must reading. Deep work. Controlling our attention, controlling our attitude. You don't want to be that kind of leader that when your people have a meeting with you, they ask your assistant, how's the weather today? I had a boss I worked for one time because he was so mercurial that I wanted to know, was this a good time to see him or should I stay far away? Can we control our attitude? Can we control our appetites? Say no to sinful tendencies and temporary pleasures so that we can say yes to having long-term impact. Self-leadership is the most important part of leadership. Thankfully, it's also the one that we have the most control over. So the tough question I'm asking myself is, what am I doing to continue to grow so that I don't stagnate my team and derail my desire to pass on the mission to the next generation? What am I doing to continue to grow? And here's an action step. Be intentional about a morning routine that gives you the opportunity to feed yourself spiritually, intellectually, I would even argue physically. You know, your body's not just going to take care of itself on its own, and you're probably a lot more effective when you're healthy than when you're not. So to the extent that you can, take care of yourself. But that's principle number 3, focus on yourself rather than others. So in summary, succession is the measure of effective leadership. And based on this premise, Jesus was the greatest leader of all time. So if we desire to successfully pass on our mission, our vision, our core values, and culture to the next generation, we would be wise to implement the leadership strategy of Jesus, again expressed in 3 principles. Focus on the few rather than the many. Number 2, focus on relationships rather than transactions. And number 3, focus on yourself rather than others. One final example, and I'll close with this. As you probably know, and this comes from the secular world, but as you probably know, the board of directors of Apple forced Steve Jobs out in 1985. He had gotten arrogant and brash and some kind of misadventures into some products that didn't work, and they just forced him out. Well, over the next 12 years, Apple went through a string of 3 CEOs, none of which could lift the company out of the death spiral that it was in. Eventually, Apple needed a new operating system for a chip that it had developed, and they were unable to develop it internally. So they went back to Steve Jobs and bought Next Computer Company, which was his computer company. That was in 1997. They retained Jobs as an advisor. 3 months later, after watching the stock company prices skid and the company had lost money for 3 successive years, they fired then CEO Gil Amelio, and they made Jobs the interim chairman and CEO. Now, get this. At that time, Apple stock was trading for 52 cents a share. How many of you bought during that time? You did? Yeah, I wished I had. I wished I'd held on to it too. Okay, that was in 1997. 14 years later, on August the 24th, 2011, you may recall, Steve Jobs had to step down from his role at Apple for health reasons, and 40 days later, he died. On the day he retired, Apple's stock price was trading at $52 a share, 100-fold increase. And the company was worth $321 billion, making it one of the most valuable companies on the planet. That, all by itself, would be an amazing thing, and would demonstrate that Steve Jobs, whether we like his methodologies or not, and I do take objection to some of them, but he was a very successful business leader. He revolutionized multiple industries, personal computers, telecommunications, even the unwieldy music industry. But I would suggest that the real measure of his success is found in what has happened to Apple since his death. Now listen to this. For starters, the Apple board did not have to go outside the company. And that so often happens, doesn't it? They had plenty of people. In fact, Steve had 10 people on his executive team that had been with them since 1997 or 1998. They chose Tim Cook. Now, interestingly, if you were reading the tech press during that time, as I'm kind of a geek, so I like to read the tech press, everybody was saying it's just a matter of time before Apple falls on its face. Tim Cook doesn't have the charisma. The business is not going to be sustained. It will never, reach the former glory days of Steve Jobs. But here are the facts. None of Jobs' executives left as a result of the board's appointment of Cook. That's pretty astonishing. Because this is an industry, some of you are in the tech industry, you know, a lot of pride, sometimes arrogance. And for those executives who maybe would have thought they were passed over, didn't seem to bother them. They stayed on, they're still there. In fact, only his CFO has retired since Jobs left, and he retired just because he was at that age where he wanted to. In the 6 years since Cook has been the CEO, Apple's stock price has tripled. From $52 a share to almost $152. Apple has also tripled in value, making it the world's most valuable company. It will probably soon be a $1 trillion company. Now, I get that money and financial performance is not the only measure of success, but it's one we can measure. And maybe the jury's still out. You know, maybe Tim Cook will stumble. Maybe the executive team won't do it. They were saying, you know, several years ago that as soon as they run out of Steve's ideas, you know, it's all over. That hasn't happened yet. What does this mean for you and for me as leaders? Well, let me loop back to where I began. Succession is the measure of effective leadership. If we're serious about passing on our mission to the next generation, then we would do well to implement the leadership strategy of Jesus. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for an incredible presentation. I'm just going to make a quick comment. About 10 or 15 years ago, I was in the kitchen, and my 6-year-old little daughter, Chloe, I was talking to her about something, telling her to do something or whatever. And she looked up at me and she said, "Daddy, are you angry or is that just your face?" It slayed me.
Yeah.
I had exactly the same experience, been trying to recover ever since. And so I just wanted to thank you for sharing that authentic piece of yourself, because I thought I was the only horrible father.
You just got to get your face wired up and then you're good. John?
At Ancient Faith, we have the privilege of Deacon Michael serving as the chairman of our board, and I can tell you from firsthand experience that he lives what he preaches. There is no more encouraging leader that I have ever been with, and Deacon Michael, so thank you for that. I'd like for you to address, because of the growing trend toward virtual offices, people working out of their homes, teams spread out across the country as we are. Give us some tips on how to encourage and develop that inner circle camaraderie from a distance.
Yeah, great question. How many of you are in that situation where you have remote workers? Yeah, so in our company, we currently have 28 employees. We don't have an office. We actually do have an office that we're renovating right now. I'll tell you more about that in a minute and what it's for. But we've seen incredible productivity as a result of that. You know, there's just a lot of stuff, a lot of time inside a centralized office that is unproductive, a lot of distractions and all the rest. The flip side of that, however, is that you don't have the relationship to be face-to-face and to build these relationships. And I think it speaks to the depth and the mystery of the human personality, that it can't all be communicated digitally. And so I think as leaders, you have to intentionally build in times to get together. So I'll just tell you some kind of from the lesser to the greater. We use video conferencing extensively so that we at least get to see each other on a regular basis. We also intentionally get together once a month for an all-day meeting. So we do team training and then usually something fun. And most of our people are in the Nashville area, even though they're remote. We have, I think, 4 people that are out of state right now. So it's not a huge expense for us, but we get together. More and more, we're insisting that people live in the area because we see the value of this. Now, the other thing we're doing with our office that's kind of interesting is we leased some office space several months ago, and we just gotten the city to approve it. It's in downtown Franklin where I live. But we're not creating this as an office that everybody has to come into. We're creating it as what some people call a co-working space, so that nobody's required to come, but everyone's invited to come. And we think that's going to be awesome. The only full-time person that we'll have there is a full-time receptionist and barista. Got to have good coffee. Does that help? Okay. And by the way, the fun's hugely important. And the other thing too, and John, you've been close enough to see this, but every year we take our team on a vacation. So just away for 5 days, and we don't talk about business. We do one short presentation on the vision for the next year, but the rest of it we're just getting to know each other. Yes, ma'am.
So when you talk about nurturing your inner circle, does it have to be, should it be as a group, or is there a one-on-one within that circle?
I think it's both. You know, it's interesting that most of Jesus' discipling of the 12 was in a group. Now, I'm not saying he didn't do one-on-one. I don't want to make an argument from absence, but most of it was in a group. I do one-on-one meetings. Like I meet with my executive assistant, I meet with our COO on a weekly basis, one-on-one. But most of it's in small groups with my executive team. Is there a question back here? Whoop. Oh, sorry.
Right here, yeah. You mentioned how with your daughters that you thought you had to be all put together and not show weakness. And then something came up where you saw the success of the opposite of that, of going ahead and being vulnerable and showing some weakness. I realize there's a different dynamic when it comes to your staff, but I'm sure there's some insights that you've gained also in that respect that have led to successes of not being all put together necessarily all the time with your staff too. Can you speak about that a little bit, please?
Yeah. I think you kind of have to intentionally look for those opportunities. And obviously there's some things, like here's an example. Back when I was at Thomas Nelson, there was a power struggle in the board. It was incredibly unnerving to me. And we fought through it for about 2 years. If I had shared the details of that with my team, it would have completely unnerved them too, right? So that's not what I'm talking about. That's unproductive. But if there are things that I don't understand or that I'm wrestling with myself, like recently this happens once a year, I realize that I've overcommitted on my schedule. And to be able to go to my staff and say, look, here I am again. I'm overcommitted. I don't know why I keep doing this, but I need you guys to help me. Now, that kind of sharing of what I'm struggling with actually draws them to me. Now, I don't do it for that purpose, but I'm saying that humanizes me, and they realize, oh, okay, then I guess I'm normal. And then all of a sudden, they're opening up about where they're struggling. And it's, somebody said this, I don't know who it was, but I like to give to other people the gift of going second. So being a leader means you go first, you take the initiative. And sometimes that means self-revelation, that I'm going to reveal something about me, like the fact that I went through a bankruptcy. You know, I've done this on my blog. That draws people to me. You know, that makes me more influential in their lives because they realize I'm human, I'm a sinner, I've made mistakes, I'm not on a pedestal. We don't relate to perfect leaders, except for Jesus.
So,
Whoop. Oh, sorry, you guys are handing out the mics.
yeah, I think give out the mic. Sometimes I think if you would sell us a little product to give us leadership advice in our ear, like just Proverbs, that would be awesome. So there's a business idea for you.
Thank you.
Real question. In an industry like education that's in transition, where most people have been trained in an old model of doing things and then have to get used to a new model, and then in a startup, like one I'm involved in with a really strong core team, how do you, first of all, invite new people into the strong core team without, you don't want them to feel like second-class citizens, but also help them unlearn. I work in education, often you end up working for a narcissistic boss or a top-down management team. Now you're in a flat system and you don't know what to do, which contributes, again, kind of in a circular way to feeling like an outsider in a team that's trying to make everybody an insider. How do you deal with that? Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I would say one thing is be explicit. people can't read your mind. As leaders, we expect people to read our minds. Don't they just know, right? Can't they just figure it out? And we have to be willing to express, and particularly to explain the why behind the what. Don't assume people know. And here's the worst part. In the absence of a narrative from you, they'll make up one. So, for example, when we took our company private, we were publicly held, traded on the New York Stock Exchange. When we took it private, up until that point, and I had just become the CEO about a year before that, our company was used to finding out company news through the Tennessean, which is our local newspaper, because we just didn't have a culture where we expressed anything to people first. They had to hear it from other places. Well, that creates a lot of fear, a lot of unproductive activity, because people are speculating about what's really happening behind the curtain. So when we decided, and we had some very strict guidelines from the SEC with regard to this, so we had to be very careful about how we did it. But on the day that we went private, when we announced that, we gathered all of our team together and we explained exactly why we were doing. We had the talking points written out beforehand. In fact, before we had that big company meeting, we had called all of our major stakeholders and expressed to them exactly what was about to happen. And so we made sure we were in compliance. We had a gazillion lawyers doing all this, but we made sure that we were in compliance. But we wanted people to hear the narrative from us. And here's what happens when you do that. When you have that kind of cascading, deliberate communication, you create alignment. And then everybody's on the same page. So maybe in your situation, one of the things is to get the insiders together and to just explain that we want this to be a welcoming environment for newcomers. And here's why. Here's why it's in your best interest for that to happen. How could we do that? And then to get everybody to brainstorm and come together around exactly how that's going to take place. If you're in an environment, and publishing was very much this for me, where Thomas Nelson was founded in 1798. I started some years later, but it's been a long time. And so there was a deep, entrenched culture. Well, if I had come into that culture with a weed whacker and disrespected the past, there would have been a coup. So I had to come in and respect what was good in the past and pivot from that. And I think that's always a good strategy when you're dealing with what's been there before, whether you're a pastor in a new assignment in a church, but to respect and esteem the best of what has been there, but then to build on that. Usually people will go with you when that happens. That's been my experience.
First, Paul, and then Hank, and then Cal.
Okay, great, thanks. So one, just a comment, and second, a question. The comment is that you're Alexander the Great and Apple. A friend of mine and I had been just talking about GE and how really the opposite happened under the Jack Welch era, where at one time, of course, he was thought of as the management guru in America, but you know, when he named his successor, it was the kind of same way, who's the strongest, and everybody else left, right, to go to, well, I'm not here, so they took off and went to other companies, and of course that stock's been like the worst performing stock. So
right.
Putting those two together is a pretty interesting, Alexander the Great and versus Apple and GE. But the question I had for you is, when you talk about the self, focus on yourself, and one of the things you mentioned was a morning routine, and you have a very busy life. What does that look like for you, and how much time does it usually take for you to do that self-care, focus on yourself in the morning?
Thank you for asking that question, because this is probably the most deliberate thing I do in my life. And I have literally a written morning routine that I occasionally revise. But here's what it looks like for me. This is just one person, and we coach people on this, and people have all kinds of routines. So there's no right or wrong, but this is mine. So in the morning, I have this automated with a script. Everything on my computer shuts down. So when I get up, the only running program is I read the Bible on the Kindle, and that's on my computer screen. I have my journal, and I have my prayers. I'm doing all that digitally. Nothing else is there. I could start it up, yes, but it's just a reminder, just that pause of why I've done it. So the first thing I do is I read through the scriptures. Second thing I do is that I pray. Third thing I do is that I journal. Then I go to the gym. And so I'm going to work out for an hour. When I'm working out, I'm usually listening to podcasts because that's a great way to get educated and to stay fresh and get new ideas. And then I come home, and by the way, I go to the gym with my wife. We both get up at the same time, go to bed at the same time, get up. She does her own routine. It looks different than mine. But that's what we do. Then we come home, we eat breakfast together, get dressed, and then go about our day. And so for me, that takes about 2.5 hours, if you count an hour of workout time. But there were days, and I have to say this because there are a lot of parents of young children, whenever I talk about this, that go, must be nice, right? You know, so there was a time when my morning routine literally was 7 minutes long. If I could get up in the morning, read a psalm, and say the Trisagion prayers, boom, I counted that as a win. But the important thing is to be intentional and align it with the season of life that you're in. Does that help?
That's great.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you for adding the point about,
Well, I have to tell you a funny story about that. When I was in college, not Orthodox yet, I read the biography of John Wesley. And in it, he said, I doubt seriously that a man can grow spiritually unless he spends 4 hours a day in prayer. And I was like, threw the book away. I said, well, no hope for me. So it wasn't too encouraging. Hank?
Yeah, you don't need affirmation, but I just wanted to say publicly that not only have you been my publisher, but you were at my chrismation. And beyond that, you gave us the skills to transition into social media. And so that is sort of prologue to a question. You not only invest yourself in people within your organization, but you have chosen to invest yourself in people outside your organization so that we too can achieve in our space. Maybe you can address that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I do. I am so committed to this concept of working with the few. And I know the most transformational things that have ever happened in my life have been in interactions with a few mentors that took the time to interact with me in a moment that I didn't really even know how important it was. And then looking back on that, I see that it made a huge difference. And so for me, I just always want to be available to God, if He would so choose, that I could be used in somebody else's life. Now, having said that, I'm very particular about giving access. Because if you're available to everybody, you're available to nobody. And the last thing I would want to have happen is to serve the masses and lose my children or lose my team. Those are the people that by virtue of proximity, God has placed in my path, and my allegiance is to them first. So those people that are the most proximate get the most attention. Because you can't really practice the with Him principle without that. So I don't know, those are just some random
Callie,
thoughts.
and then Michelle, and then Charles, and then George, and then Eric.
Thank you so much for everything you've shared. My question has to do with those circles of influence. How do you suggest an organization, a company, scale as it grows when you're going from that 3 to 12 or that 12 to 70 level? Do you have any strategies or things you would like to offer for helping us build that communication?
She started her own book publishing.
She told me at the break, it's amazing. Yeah, well, I think, first of all, just to ask that question about scale is really important. How does it scale? The thing that I love about the leadership strategy of Jesus is that it does scale. Because if you model this for your people, they will do it with their people. So my daughter, who's the CEO of my company, she does the same thing I do with her own inner circle. And it really does work. But you just got to be intentional. I think another thing is just hire great people. You know, That's a key, where you can really focus on not just kind of getting them up to zero, but focus on taking them from wherever they're at to the next level.
I think a lot of us in the church tend to be people pleasers, and I think we also, in our minds, sanctify that as self-emptying and
Right.
giving. So how do you focus on self? What boundaries do you put in that arena so that you can provide for yourself and your health and your spiritual welfare, but also for your team? Like, is there a cutoff? Do you have decisions you make in a specific way?
This is a great question. And I promise you I'm going to get in trouble with the answer. But I'm going to answer it anyway. I think it's important to have a clear set of priorities. Because when push comes to shove, you're going to have to choose, and you don't want to choose unwisely. Now, I'm going to give you an example, and then I'm going to come back and deconstruct it. So, in the middle of the recession, which was brutal. How many of you went through the recession and it was brutal? Oh yeah, all of us. It was tough, right? I mean, our revenues fell 20% in 18 months. And at scale, at Thomas Nelson, that was significant. You know, we ended up laying off more than 20% of the staff. It was really hard. And most of us in senior management didn't take vacations for over a year. It was just all hands on deck trying to keep the ship afloat. I finally told the board I was going to take a vacation and I was going to go to Colorado with my wife. So they said, yeah, fine. I left, went through Dallas, landed in Dallas to change planes, checked my email, and I had an email from the chairman of the board. And he said, hey, look, by the way, it was the same guy I told you about earlier. He said, I need you to come back. We're going to be in Nashville on Monday, and there's some things we need to review. My heart sank. I showed it to Gail. She about started crying. I mean, we really needed this time for our marriage, for our health, for our sanity. And she just kind of took a deep breath, and she said, honey, you do whatever you need to do. I'll stand behind you. I said, okay. So I wrote him back, and I said, I won't be there. As I told you, I'm going on a much-needed vacation. I'll make sure our CFO is queued up to give you everything you need. Turned off my phone, literally turned it off, didn't check it till I got back. Naturally, I was curious. So I walked into my CFO's office when I got back. May or may not have been the first thing I did. And I said, so that meeting last week, how'd that go? He said, that was the biggest waste of time. He said, everything could have been handled via email. Now, I was able to make that decision, and believe me, there have been times when I've not chosen well, but I was able to make that decision because I had a clear list of priorities. Now, here's how my priorities look, and this is the part that's going to be controversial. I think we can all agree in our priorities that God comes first, right? But then here's what a lot of Christians do under what I think is false piety. You know, they may put the church next, they may put their family next, they may put a whole bunch of things, and they put themselves at the very end. He who loses his life shall save it, and, you know, quote a bunch of verses like that, right? I actually put myself second. Now, here's why. How many of you flew to get here? How many of you paid attention to the flight attendant as she was dutifully going through, or he was dutifully going through the thing before he took off? In the event of a sudden loss of cabin pressure, you know, oxygen masks will descend from the ceiling. Please put it on yourself before you attempt to help somebody else. So here's how that works for me. If I don't give attention to my health, if I don't give attention to my marriage, and those things, you know, if the wheels come off, that's going to affect my organization. Plus, here's the worst part about it. And for those of you that are pastors, I think this is really critical. I think because pastors don't feel like they have permission to not work. They got to be on call 24/7. Not only is that bad for them personally because they can't give the attention they need to their own self-care, appropriate self-care, not narcissism. They can't give attention to their family. And I'm in the middle of a situation in another church right now where a pastor's kids are completely off the rails because he was always gone ministering to the flock, not to his family. But if you don't make time, the first thing is your own health and well-being will suffer. But the worst thing is, hear me on this, you're modeling for other people. The law of replication takes effect. I had a CFO one time who was in his 50s who used to never leave the office before 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And I finally went to him and I said to him, I said, Jim, you cannot work this late. He said, but there's so much to do. I've got to get it done. And he wore it as a badge of honor. Which, by the way, in our culture, you ask somebody how they're doing, they say busy. It sounds like they're complaining, they're bragging. And that's kind of how it was for him. I'm a hard worker. I've got the company's best interest at heart. I said, here's the problem. You're in your 50s, you can do that. But you've got young families, and you're modeling for them what's expected of them. And that's why these people that are working for you are still here at night when they need to be home with their family. This is the ripple effect. It's the law of replication. And it's important that we get this right. So to literally write down your priorities. And by the way, if you change your priorities, particularly if you're a pastor, you got to explain it. Because people are going to come up with a narrative. Well, you just don't care. What's changed? You've suddenly gotten lazy. No, explain it. Here's why I'm doing what I'm doing, and here's why it's in your best interest long term. And it is in their best interest. And it's in your best interest. Sorry, I just stumbled into preaching. But I feel deeply about that because I've seen too many leaders crash and burn.
Leadership content's often based on and celebrates success. And most of the advice is taken and can be implemented relatively effectively in a successful situation. Most of us, I think, spend some or large amounts of time in unsuccessful situations, or that are struggling, or that were successful and now are flagging. So how do you think about these principles that you've laid out if your organization is on the verge of collapse or is struggling, deeply? Do they really apply quite the same way? Because as I was thinking about it, some of these things are very easy to implement if the organization has the resources, is growing, is successful, et cetera. And I just would like you to comment on how would they apply if that were not the case?
I think it's actually even more important in times of crisis. One of the things that can happen in a crisis is everything can get very transactional. You're dealing with complaints, you're dealing with the bank, you're trying to figure out how you're going to make payroll. I've been in all those situations. It can get very transactional. The problem is that we're relational beings, and people crave that relational thing. I thought of it this way with my kids. By the way, one of the best books I ever read on parenting was How to Really Love Your Child. And one of his first of 3 principles in that book was a principle of focused attention. And it's like, he said, think of your child as almost having a gas tank that gets to empty, and nothing ever works emotionally or relationally when they're on empty. And so that you have to intentionally fill their tank back up. And you have to fill their tank back up by spending time with them, by listening to them, by helping them troubleshoot. And you can't afford not to do that in a crisis. Now, I get that the pace of life may be really busy, but you've got to do something, even if it's minimally, to spend time with other people. You still got to focus on the few. You can't just be so worried about your customers, taking care of them, that you don't take care of your people. Because at the end of the day, here's my theory. If I take care of my direct reports, they'll take care of the customers, that will take care of the board, and the board will take care of me. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't say, well, I got to take care of the board, or I got to take care of the customers, and not take care of my own people, my own inner circle. That's the first and foremost job. What do they need? And it's more relational and more emotional than you think. And think of it this way. When you're feeling confident and affirmed, and your emotional tank is full, how much can you accomplish? I mean, it's like night and day, right? You have your confidence shattered, or you start to go through self-doubt, you won't even attempt stuff. And so I see that as my role as the CEO, as being the chief encourager, even in difficult times.
How do you deal with performance issues as a good leader? So if you hire well, that's great. But I'm curious if you have any words to say about how Jesus dealt with performance issues. Obviously, there was a performance issue with one of the disciples.
And it didn't end so well for him.
It didn't go so well, yeah. So thankfully, we don't have that sort of performance issue. But how would you deal with performance issues when maybe you've chosen wrongly or something has gone awry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have an entire podcast that I did on my website at michaelhyatt.com on how to fire people. It's a two-part series. One of it's how to hire people, and then the second part is how to fire people and how to fire people well. Because I think Christians are particularly bad at this. Because kind of our compassion and sense of ministry and all that gets wrapped up in it. And again, the truth is good for everybody. So we just had a performance issue at our company last week. So we had somebody that we hired, despite the fact that they'd had multiple interviews, despite the fact that we went through an extensive process, they just didn't work out. And it was a mismatch. So once we come to that point, and by the way, a signal for us is once we start documenting their lack of performance, it's only a matter of time. I've very rarely seen it remediated. I don't know, maybe your mileage may vary, but that's been my case. So what we did was we said, I was meeting with the hiring manager her supervisor, and I said, what do you think we need to do? She said, I don't think it could be remediated. We've given her a number of chances, and so I think we should terminate her. I said, I think we should too. So here were a couple things. First of all, we always create talking points before going into those conversations so that we're direct, so that we're kind, and so that we answer the questions of what this is going to mean for them. We never allow a back door. So we don't kind of like back into it. The conversation always starts like this. We decided that we're going to terminate you, and that decision is irrevocable. And then we just let that set in. And that's hard, right? And sometimes people will burst into tears. Sometimes I can tell you a lot of stories, but they know that it was coming. And then we say, let me explain why. And then we don't go into a lot of detail. We're very brief, but we try to give them some rationale, knowing that they're probably going to have to share this with somebody else, like their spouse. And then we say, here's what it means for you. Here's what's going to happen from here on out. Because once you get to that first thing, everybody's saying, well, what does that mean? What does that mean? What is that going to mean for me? Is there going to be a severance? What about my benefits? What am I going to tell my family? So we go through all that. And this is just us, and you may not be able to do this if you're in a company that's really struggling, but we try to be overly generous. Our goal, and I found this in the recession. I got my executive team in the boardroom at Thomas Nelson, and I said, how do we want people to feel after we've let them go? And so people said, well, it doesn't matter what we do, they're going to feel terrible. Okay, let's write that up there. Yes, they're going to grieve. What else? We want them to feel like we dealt with them honestly, fairly, humanely. We want them to feel like we respected them. Because honestly, before I came on board, when we fired somebody, we walked back to their back to their office with boxes and escorted them out of the building. That's horrible. There's no excuse for that. So we said we're going to deal with them as humans. And we're going to hold their hand even after they left the company. Call, check in. I made so many phone calls after we let people go to say, hey, I was just thinking about you. How are you doing? Is there anything I can do? Now, obviously you can't do that if somebody's embezzled money or, but I mean, just a normal performance thing. And I see it as this. The faster that I can get them on to their next assignment where it's really a fit, the happier they're going to be, the happier we're going to be. Does that help at all? Probably someone answer questions.
Excuse me. So how long of a mentorship before you get to that point? And I realize that's almost an impossible question to answer in the general, but sometimes these things have long tails.
Yes.
Right? And they can, how do you deal with these disruptions of performance as a good leader, short of firing someone?
Yeah, well, in the remedial phase, I would give them very specific results that I want. that are objective, that are measurable. So they know, for example, if they're to deliver a strategy document by X date or something else that is specific, and if they don't meet it, they've essentially taken themselves out of the game, right?
She's a partner with Covington and Berlin. She
Ah.
deals with all that.
Deacon Gregory, Colorado Springs. Question, I'm trying to articulate this, but I was a youth pastor, 2000, Free Methodist Church, before I converted to Orthodoxy. One of the things I've just been wrestling with, part of the reason I guess I'm here to trying to figure out is how, a lot of these leadership principles of business. I will tell you, John Maxwell, which I feel like I heard, even some influence there with some of the things you talked about today. I still use John Maxwell stuff for leadership within my business, with training people. One of the things I struggled with back in 2000, even leading a church team, was I always struggled with John Maxwell when it came to what I felt like him imposing sort of all these business strategies into the church world. I just really struggled with kind of that way he took that into it. And I don't know, right or wrong, I still wrestle with it. And so I guess maybe uniquely as a deacon who has also lives in the business world, maybe one foot in, one, in different worlds, I guess I still still struggle, even though how to resolve, what's influencing, what's shaping you. Anyway, I don't know if that's...
It's a good question, and it's certainly worth wrestling through. Here's my presupposition. All of life is spiritual. All truth is God's truth. I don't see a dichotomy between the secular and the sacred. I try to conduct my business as though it were a ministry, unto the Lord. But that doesn't mean that there aren't significant, important truths that can be found in business. What I think most people object to, and what I would object to, is if we conduct the church's affairs as though it were merely business. I think there needs to be financial accountability. There needs to be, good HR practices, all the rest of that, but to a spiritual end. And so I think one of the things that really attracted to me Orthodoxy was sort of this organic, comprehensive worldview that meant that I didn't have to have some things that were outside of the temple and other things that were inside of the temple, and two sets of presuppositions to run on. By the way, I know Tim spoke to you earlier, and his boss, Dan Cathy at Chick-fil-A, he once told me, and I love this, he said, honestly, what we're doing, he said, this is a ministry disguised as a chicken business. I like that.
Thank you very,
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.